Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service on this Monday, June 5th, 2023. If you'd like additional weather information on top of what I provide, you can go to weather.gov. It'll bring you to a point-and-click map of the continental U.S. with Alaska and Hawaii to the lower left. You point and click anywhere on that map. It'll give you a forecast with any relevant watches, warnings, or advisories. On the map this Monday afternoon, of biggest note are all these air quality advisories across areas of the Great Lakes on into the Northeast due to the massive wildfires that are occurring across much of Canada. The satellite imagery shows just a broad area of wildfire smoke over the Great Lakes, Wisconsin, out through the Ohio Valley into the Northeast. Massive wildfire right there in Quebec province. So this has been kind of the story here of the late spring, early summer. Much like last year in 2022, Alaska was off to the races with just a really significant fire season. Well, this year it's been east of us in Canada, but we have had some red flag warnings, one for the Copper River Basin this afternoon up through 9 p.m. tonight for elevated critical fire weather conditions, and then there'll be another one for tomorrow for areas of the middle upper Tanana Valley, eastern Alaska range. But by far the most serious fire weather conditions there are out across portions of Canada. Over 400 wildfires so far, 10 times the average, and this is early in the season for them. We've had just this dome of high pressure and very warm to hot air with very dry conditions sitting over western, central, and at times pushing even eastward into eastern Canada. Here in Alaska, though, the good news is the river breakup season is done, at least the threat of ice jam flooding. We still, though, have some lowland flooding as a result of the high water levels from all of the snowmelt that has to go through the river system, so that's going to be slow to recede over the next week or two. And overall, going into mid-June, extended temperature precipitation outlook generally unchanged. Continued below normal temperatures, especially across the southern mainland. Well, right now we do have a fire. We have high fire danger and a red flag warning for the Gulkana area in the Copper River Basin. Mostly sunny temperatures, just breaking 70 early this afternoon. But as we go further southwestward along the western Gulf Coast, cloudy areas of fog and rain, 45 degrees at Kodiak. So as of this afternoon and evening, a red flag warning for the Copper River Basin, including Glen Allen, and then for tomorrow, Tuesday afternoon and evening, it'll be the eastern half of the Alaska range and areas just north of there, especially the middle upper Tanana Valley, for very warm temperatures and at least low 70s with breezy conditions and low humidities. And the fire danger has crept upward again, even though we had some rather cloudy and wet conditions last week. Very high fire danger is returning. Copper River Basin, middle upper Tanana Valley, areas of the Yukon Flats along the Alcan border, and then also central North Slope areas. But the good news is with the rivers are open. No ice jam flooding to worry about anymore. We got past that now. Just a lot of water coming down the river system, so it's going to take a while for those water levels to come down. First the creeks, first the headwaters, then eventually the lower sections of the river basins. Cloud cover this afternoon. We do have an area of low pressure here off of the Alaska Peninsula, another low back out toward the western portion of the Aleutians. Coolest temperatures are up along the Arctic and northwest coast here. Otherwise, where there has been some sunshine, temperatures have managed to reach at least mid-70s. Eagle was 75 degrees as of 2 o'clock this afternoon. And we can see some areas of sun, a few isolated showers, even a rumble of thunder could pop up in here through areas of the interior, especially as we go through midweek. A little better chance Wednesday into Thursday. Here's a couple areas of low pressure off to the west as we go into later tonight. Just a couple of lows, one in the North Pacific, one back here in the southeast Bering, and then another back out toward the west. And as we go through Tuesday afternoon, we're going to watch, this is the region of just general areas of low pressure, the lower portion of the Bering Sea and along the Aleutian chain, but they are not really that strong for this time of year. There's some areas of rain and some showers around there. Weak trough of low pressure will just sit across the central interior, be kind of a focus, a boundary there where we may see some scattered showers, isolated storms try to pop up as we go, especially through midweek by the time we get into Wednesday afternoon, evening. But no real heavy batches of precipitation. Lows tonight will be mid-40s to near 50 degrees along the Yukon River. Elsewhere, much of the state in the 40s, near freezing along the Arctic coast. We'll see some 70s returning here to areas of the central, eastern, and interior. One of the reasons why in this area here in the middle upper Tanana Valley we'll have that red flag warning in effect for Tuesday afternoon and evening. Wednesday morning lows near or just above 50 along the middle upper Yukon, near freezing along the Arctic coast, and generally 40s elsewhere. And then again, temperatures back up here across the central, eastern, interior could get back up into the 70s, which is still kind of below normal for this time of year. Typically, we'd start seeing more in the way of some 80-degree readings around here, and cooler than normal temperatures will continue, especially across along and south of the Alaska range, across south central areas, the western northern Gulf area. So look at this. Nothing has really changed from what I've been showing you for the past several weeks. We're going to continue to see temperatures average below normal, centered on the southern third of the mainland, especially along and south of the Alaska range, areas surrounding Cook Inlet, the Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound. So this just goes unchanged. And then occasionally it's going to be wet, some showers or areas of rain, especially along coastal areas of the Gulf, and we anticipate precipitation could average around or a bit above normal across a good portion of the mainland. So we're not going to see any really widespread sunny, warmer, hot weather where we would have dry conditions, and which would really elevate fire danger on a broader scale across the state of Alaska. All of that's going to stay back out toward the central part of Canada. Just a big warm dome of hot air there, going to create further problems with the fire weather season there to our neighbor off to the east there in Canada.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Here is your aviation weather for any flights planned this Tuesday or Wednesday. Low pressure is generally going to be situated through the lower Bering Sea, just north of the western and central Aleutians, and then a broad southeasterly flow out over the western Gulf, and the south side of the Alaska Peninsula will keep widespread IFR conditions with lower ceilings and areas of rain. As we go across areas of the interior, VFR conditions are anticipated. A little warmer temperatures, especially up through the east central interior, up the Tanana Valley, and then really hot weather back out across central Canada. They have quite a problem there with just very excessive heat and extreme fire danger. But here in Alaska, still relatively cool, and we could start to see some scattered showers and isolated thunderstorms popping up with the daytime heating Tuesday afternoon and evening, especially along the south side of the Brooks Range to the Yukon River east toward the 40-mile Gold Country. Widespread IFR conditions in through the Gulf, as well as out over much of the central Bering Sea, and then off of the northwestern Arctic coast up and through the Arctic Ocean, a broad area of high pressure there, keeping lower ceilings there along the ice that remains up there in the far north. Widespread IFR conditions anticipated Wednesday morning throughout the Gulf, south side, Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, much of the Bering Sea once you get west of the southwest mainland, and then also again north and west of the Arctic coastline. We could see some scattered showers, isolated thunderstorms again along the south side of the Brooks Range, all the way through the middle Yukon Valley eastward toward the Elcan border. Widespread IFR conditions continuing out over much of the Gulf, and then again out over the central Bering Sea, especially west of Nunavik Island, including St. Matthew down to St. Paul. Past conditions, Anaktuvik Pass should generally see VFR conditions, but an isolated storm could pop up with some cumulus and shower buildups Tuesday afternoon around the south entrance. Adigan Pass, similar situation, generally VFR conditions through the pass Tuesday, but isolated showers and storms could pop up there in the afternoon and evening. Further south, Lake Clark, Merrill, generally MVFR conditions anticipated on Tuesday. Same thing for Rainy Pass. And as we get up through the central Alaska Range eastward, generally VFR conditions are anticipated. Windy Pass through Isabel and over toward Mentasta on Tuesday. Further south and west, the Copper River Basin, generally VFR conditions, including Tanita Pass. And then as we get down toward Portage Pass in the Gulf Coast, we anticipate MVFR conditions, especially from the central portion of Portage Pass through the east entrance into Prince William Sound. And then in the far northern panhandle, we anticipate MVFR conditions, both Chilkoot and White. Freezing levels aloft are lowest over areas just inland from the panhandle. Pockets pocket of cooler air aloft, but it does warm considerably out into central Canada, and a little arm of that, 8,000 plus freezing levels aloft, extend into areas of the central, east central interior, and freezing levels fall back off to 2,000 feet associated with low pressure way on the western half of the Bering. Greatest threat for some moderate icing could occur across areas the outer Kenai coast, outer Kodiak Island, and then areas near and south and west of St. Matthew, as well as in through the central Aleutian chain, all generally above 6,000 feet, where you get into a little thicker cloud cover and some areas of moderate precipitation. The jet stream level winds are not especially strong. We do have northwesterly winds upwards of 60 to 75 knots along and south of the Aleutians, a broad belt of southeasterly winds from the Gulf across the southwest interior into the northern Bering, 60 to 70 knots at 9,000 feet or 700 millibars. A couple of low circulations here, one south of Kodiak Island, another out toward the central Aleutians, and another back toward the western Aleutians. And then by the time we bring it down to 3,000 feet, the main areas of low pressure circulation are way off in the far north central Canada, just south of Kodiak Island, the central Bering, and then back toward the western Aleutians, with high pressure located up over the Arctic Ocean there, just north of the Beaufort Sea coastline. And the greatest threat for turbulence then on Thursday will be over areas of the southwest, along the southwest coastline, Etolan Strait, Nunavik Island, St. Lawrence on over toward St. Matthew. We also see potential for some moderate turbulence along areas of the northwestern Gulf Coast, and also down along the south end of Kodiak Island, and especially out through areas of the central and western Aleutians, surface to 4,000 feet. Welcome to a special edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, and joining me is Dr. Rick Spinrad, the administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, more commonly referred to as NOAA. Dr. Spinrad, welcome back to Alaska.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here.
And, I guess we could start and ask, what's been your experience in Alaska? It sounds like you've been here several times.
I have. My first trip was actually almost 50 years ago when I was a young college student. I came up here just to see the state. I'd heard so much about it. Rode up the Inside Passage, ended up in Haines, and then ended up in Fairbanks. And then through the course of my career, I've had several opportunities to go all over the state. My last trip, in fact, was up to AKwx in February, because we have an observatory up there, just to see how we were doing there and what the nature of their activities was. On this particular trip, I'll get to see more of the state that I haven't seen.
Now, one of the newest strategic goals for NOAA is to build a climate-ready nation. Alaska is at the forefront when it comes to climate change. People in Alaska communities deal with impacts of climate change every day. What does a climate-ready nation look like in Alaska?
Think about being able to make decisions about things like what should our fisheries industry look like, or do we need to worry about moving local communities on the coast, or what can we expect the weather patterns will look like in 20 years or 30 years? How should we build our ports, our harbors, our roads, our airports differently now? If we have the best information about what the future will look like, we will be ready. And that's what we mean by a climate-ready nation. I would go so far as to add that a lot of discussion right now about climate is based on concerns about the impact on society, and rest assured we should have some concerns about that. But by the same token, if we're really good at applying the best science, we can actually benefit from and prosper with that knowledge and be well positioned for the changes we're going to see due to climate change. So all of that is part of what we mean by a climate-ready nation. And then there's pieces of that, a coastal ready nation, an Arctic-ready nation, if you will, all of those environments that are going to be impacted by the changes that we're already seeing right now. How well can we position society, individuals, corporations to deal with the changes that we're seeing?
And I think to emphasize to people, NOAA, the Weather Service, other entities, we've been gathering data of the weather, of the oceans, for years. We have that database, but also we're developing new tools to model future changes. And this is really important as we move forward because we are helping policymakers, these communities in the end, local, state, nationally, where we might need to go. And it's our mission, and it's very important that the integrity of that data is good and that we base it on sound science.
Absolutely. And you look at every aspect of our lives. And here in Alaska, one of the reasons why I felt it was so important to visit in my new capacity as NOAA administrator is because just about every aspect of life here in the state of Alaska is going to be impacted by those kinds of changes. So obviously fisheries, but also you look at just the way the weather patterns are going to affect river flow. You look at the way where ships are going to make port. Nome is a really good example. If we look at how climate is going to change, how will that impact the role that Nome plays? We're expecting to see a lot more shipping in the Arctic Ocean in the future, which means there's going to be a lot more demands, a lot more challenges to communities on the northern part of the state, on the along the Arctic, and also impacts on lifestyles associated with natural resources, like the lumber industry, the timber industry, fishing industry. So it's really important for us to make sure we're sensitive to the needs of the communities and providing the knowledge-based products that will help them make the decisions that they need to make. And emergency managers, I might add, too, because so many of the factors that we're talking about here come into play when you start looking at how, whether it's avalanches or landslides or fires or drought or floods, we need to be in a place where we can make much better predictions of where we expect to see those things happening.
And you more or less led into my next question, is what is NOAA doing right now to help ensure communities in Alaska meet this goal of becoming climate ready? So yeah, if you have any other thoughts or other examples you can highlight, I'd like to hear about it.
So a lot of examples. I mean, we're seeing in some parts of the state record-breaking precipitation going on right now. And is that going to become more the norm? Are we going to see continuing changes in how rain and snowfall hit the state? Not just how much, but the form of the snow or the rain in particular areas. The diminishment of sea ice is, of course, affecting a lot of subsistence fishing and hunting. So we're working with communities that depend on knowing where walrus are. We've got a product right here out of Anchorage, for example, that helps the subsistence hunting community know where the patterns are for haul out for walrus. We're trying to help the shipping industry by providing better sea ice forecasts, both on a short-term basis and a long-term basis. We have an active tsunami warning capability here in Alaska, headquartered here in Alaska. So that's not a climate change impact factor, although as the coasts change, the impacts of tsunamis will change in the coasts as well. So being able to understand how the coasts are changing, how sea level is changing, is also part of our responsibility. And those tend to be, I mean, we do a lot of that throughout the country, including in the lower 48, but the unique aspects of sea ice, the unique aspect of the fisheries and how they're changing here in Alaska, the unique aspects of the impacts of sea level change to especially the coastal communities on the North Slope are particularly relevant to the population in Alaska.
So climate change makes the Arctic a strategic and economic hotspot, and Alaska is what makes the U.S. an Arctic nation. Can you tell us something about NOAA's Arctic initiatives?
And the best way to talk about that is, again, in the context of a climate-ready nation, but also in the context of what are the responsibilities that we have. So we have a responsibility for dealing with fisheries, and fisheries are fundamentally changing here in the state. I've had the opportunity to talk with some of the major industry representatives for fisheries. So we're trying to provide good predictions and projections of how the fisheries will change, where the fish will be, if you will, in the future. We're also looking to how the Arctic itself will change. I've been having a number of discussions with Coast Guard, and I'll be talking with our colleagues in DOD about what is our support responsibility for what may be increased activity in the Arctic in the future as well. And then, of course, there's the sort of standard requirement for having skillful weather forecast, and that's changing too. Even folks in the lower 48 know that what's happening here in the Arctic in terms of weather patterns is affecting weather throughout the country. So having a better understanding of the weather patterns and their predictability and improving our observational capabilities. So we're launching new satellites to make even better observations here in the high latitudes in the Arctic and in Alaska specifically. Though all those tools are focused on our general set of responsibilities, but on specific challenges that we have here in Alaska and in the Arctic.
And certainly we've known from research that some of the most rapid weather and climate changes are happening in the Arctic and subarctic regions of the world.
Yeah, and as we saw just last week with the announcement of the speed of change in sea ice and temperatures in the Arctic being, I think the number is 4 times faster than people expected, the trite but relevant statement that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic is even more relevant right now. And so we're trying to get ahead of the curve to understand, okay, if we're seeing the reduction of sea ice, if we're seeing the increased temperatures and highly variable temperatures in the Bering Sea and in the Arctic as well, what does that mean for all of these responsibilities that we have for predicting weather, for understanding fisheries, for understanding sea level rise and impacts on coastal communities?
Dr. Spinrad, it's been a pleasure talking to you about all the important things happening with NOAA in Alaska. Thank you for your time and expertise. And thank you for those of you watching and joining in on this special edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
We lead into our marine segment with the sea ice, and one thing of note is that the ice is melting off. In the far north, we still have a fair amount of ice there along the far Arctic coast from Utqiagvik to Kaktovik. A number of openings along the shoreline as well as out through the lower Chukchi Sea, down through the Bering Strait. This will only continue since we are now just a few weeks away, actually a couple of weeks away now from the summer solstice, and then going further south, the areas of pack ice out through the northern portion of the Bering have greatly diminished. They continue to melt away along areas of Norton Sound on up toward the east side of St. Lawrence Island, and the trend will only continue as we get now into the summer season. Now for the inner panhandle channels, we expect winds to be northerly 10 knots in the vicinity of Metlakatla and Ketchikan, but southeast to south 10 to 15 knots, Stevens Passage on up toward Lynn Canal, waves 2 to 3 feet. Outer coast winds 10 to 15 knots off of Craig and Sitka, but 20 to 25 knots, especially up there in the northeastern corner of the Gulf, with waves as high as 8 to 10 feet. On Wednesday, for the inner channels, north wind in Lynn Canal 10 knots, waves a couple of feet, and east wind there at Stevens Passage at 10 knots, and then a southeast wind with 10-knot winds there around Ketchikan, and waves generally just a couple of feet. For the nearshore waters of the outer coast, winds will generally be out of the southeast to east around 20 knots, though as high as 30 knots there just off of Cape Suckling, with waves 6 to maybe as high as 7 to 9 feet there west of Yakutat Bay. For the northeastern Gulf Coast or northwestern Gulf Coast, winds will be out of the east upwards of 25 knots, 20 knots within Prince William Sound with 4-foot waves. Look for northeast to north winds upper middle Cook Inlet at 20 knots, easterly winds to 25 knots at the entrance of Cook Inlet with waves 4 to 5 feet. And for Wednesday, winds in Prince William Sound will remain easterly 15 knots, waves 3 feet. Look for northeast winds 15 knots, upper middle Cook Inlet with waves of 3 to 4 feet, and then easterly winds of 25 knots there just northeast of Kodiak City and on in towards the entrance of Cook Inlet with waves 5 to as high as 8 feet. Along Kodiak Island, winds will be northeast to east 20 to 25 knots, waves 5 feet, Shelikof Strait. Generally an easterly component component to the wind across the Alaska Peninsula, turning more southerly once you get down toward Cold Bay and False Pass. Waves 5 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side, 2 to maybe 4 feet on the Bering side. And for Wednesday, winds will be northeast to east, 15 to 20 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island, and then easterly to southeasterly across the northern half of the peninsula, and then variable winds southeast of Sandpoint and north of Cold Bay, south of False Pass, with waves 3 feet on the Bering side and 5 to maybe as high as 7 feet on the North Pacific side. The Aleutian chain will generally see southwest winds around 20 knots on Tuesday, with waves running 7 to 10 feet eastern central Aleutians, 13 feet west of Adak on the North Pacific side, and 5 to 6 feet eastern central Aleutians on the Bering side, to 9 to 10 feet as you get west of Adak to Shemya. And then for Wednesday, we do have a low circulation that's working its way eastward. Winds variable, far eastern Aleutians around 10 knots, but then look for southwest to west winds around 15 to 20 knots, especially through the central Aleutians. Waves 7 to 8 feet on the North Pacific side and 4 or 5 feet on the Bering side. Along the southwest coast, offshore flow easterly out of Norton Sound, the lower Yukon Delta, 20 to 25 knots, as high as 30-knot winds out of the east at St. Matthew, as well as southeast winds to 30 knots in Kuskokwim Bay, with waves as high as 10 feet in the vicinity of St. Matthew. Generally, an easterly offshore flow continues across the southwestern mainland. Look for winds 5 knots out of Norton Sound, northeast to east winds 15 knots off of the lower Yukon Delta, and easterly winds 20 knots out of Bristol and Kuskokwim Bays, with waves running a few feet. Along the Arctic coast, northeast winds 15 knots. They increase upwards of 20 to 25 knots as you get down toward Point Lay and Point Hope. And then look for northeast winds through the Bering Strait, 20 to as high as 25 knots on the north side of St. Lawrence Island. And then for Wednesday, winds will generally have a northerly component there along the Arctic coast, northeast 10 to as high as 25 knots along the northwestern coast there, west of Point Lay and Wainwright. And then look for winds to turn more north to northeasterly through the Bering Strait to the north side of St. Lawrence Island at 15 knots.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.